Chapter 1. Plainfield's Quiet Ghosts. The road into Plainfield stretches like a scar across the skin of central Wisconsin. Lonely, straight, and somehow older than it looks. In the dead of winter, it turns glassy with black ice, winding through frozen marshland and miles of cornfields shaved down to brittle stalks. Snowdrifts pile up at the shoulders, untouched for days. Even in spring, the town feels sunken, like something that's been left out in the rain too long. There were no big welcome signs, no motels, no tourist stops. In the 1950s, Plainfield wasn't on the way to anywhere. People didn't visit unless they had family. You didn't stumble across Plainfield. You were born there, married there, worked there, died there. Maybe, if you were lucky, you left. But most people didn't. They didn't want to. There was something sacred in the stillness, something reassuring in the way life just didn't change. The town wasn't rich, but it wasn't poor either. Just working class. Meat and potatoes people, mostly farmers and loggers, some shopkeepers, a couple of barbers, a few war veterans still living in drafty wood frame houses passed down from their parents. Men drove Fords and Chevys. Women wore aprons and ironed shirts with careful hands. Children were raised on manners in church, and people went to bed early. Everyone knew everyone. If you farted in your kitchen, someone probably smelled it by dinner. It was that kind of place. Gossip wasn't mean-spirited, just inevitable. A town of 700 doesn't leave much room for secrets. Or so they believed. In truth, Plainfield had always been the kind of place that preferred its mysteries unsolved. If a man drank too much, people said he was just tired. If a woman disappeared into the house for weeks at a time, they said she was unwell. There was a quiet agreement not to pry. Live and let live. It's not that people didn't see things. They just chose not to look too closely. And that blindness was the soil in which something monstrous took root. People would later say Ed Gein slipped through the cracks, but there were no cracks. He was woven in. He was part of the town's furniture. Odd, yes, but not dangerous. Ed helped. Ed listened. He smiled. He quoted the Bible in a low, bashful voice and never once raised it in anger. He wore old clothes and smelled a bit off. But who didn't? He'd inherited his family's land, lost his mother, and lived alone. That made him tragic, not terrifying. If anyone noticed how thin he looked, how his eyes didn't blink quite enough, how he stared too long at women's faces, they kept it to themselves. What good would it do to stir up trouble? Ed was harmless, always had been. He babysat. He plowed driveways. He was the one who stood quietly in the back of the church, hat clutched in both hands, mouthing along to hymns. It's easy to judge in hindsight, to call people stupid, gullible. But truth is, Plainfield wasn't naive. It was trusting. It had to be. The cold and the isolation made trust a survival skill. If your truck slid into a ditch at night, you had to believe someone would stop and help. If your child went missing, you had to believe someone would call. That kind of dependency creates blind spots. You don't suspect the man who fixes your gutters. You can't, because the alternative is too awful to consider. The cops weren't used to blood. The worst they saw were bar fights and drunk driving accidents. A domestic squabble if things got real bad. Not murders, not disappearances, not women vanishing off the face of the earth. And certainly not bodies, real human bodies, turned into furniture. But that's what was waiting behind the door of the Gein farmhouse. They say it started with a receipt, a simple line item in a hardware store ledger, written in the tidy cursive of a woman named Bernice Warden. She'd sold Ed a gallon of antifreeze the morning she went missing. That's all. But that was enough. Enough to crack the seal. And when they kicked the door in, those small-town deputies, the ones who spent most of their days dealing with cow theft and tax disputes, they found a world no one should have to see. A gutted carcass hanging upside down like a deer. A skull turned into a soup bowl. a face stretched and tacked to the wall, nipples glued to a belt, a chair upholstered with human skin, and worst of all, the silence, as if the house itself was holding its breath. What kind of man does that? What kind of man butchers his mother, digs up the dead, and stitches together a costume of womanhood from corpses? What kind of man wears that skin, stands in front of a cracked mirror, and smiles? The kind that everyone thought was just a little odd. The kind you'd nod to on the street. The kind you'd thank for helping carry groceries to your car. The horror wasn't just in the crimes. It was in how close he'd always been. Even after he was arrested, even after the stories came out, people in Plainfield couldn't make the pieces fit. They talked in hushed voices, behind cupped hands, over burnt coffee and cheap whiskey. "It can't be true," they said. "Not Ed, not our Ed," as if using his first name made it less real, as if familiarity could erase the bodies. There's a particular kind of fear that comes from realizing you never knew the truth about someone. But there's a worse fear, the one that says maybe you did know. Maybe some part of you always suspected. Maybe that chill you felt when you looked at your daughter wasn't random. Maybe you just didn't want the trouble. In the months that followed, Plainfield sealed up. People left. Reporters swarmed in like crows. The farmhouse was burned down. The ground itself seemed to recoil. But the air never cleared. The sky never got brighter. Something had been unearthed, not just in Ed's cellar, but in the town's own conscience. A truth that wouldn't go away. Plainfield, Wisconsin, will forever be remembered for Ed Gein. Not its logging history, not its community values, not the maple syrup festivals or the 4th of July parades. Just the butcher, the ghoul, the quiet man with the strange smile who wore women like suits and loved his mother too much. He didn't come from nowhere. He came from here, and the ground still hasn't healed. Chapter 2. The Gein Farmhouse. The Gein farmhouse sat about 6 miles outside of Plainfield, down a stretch of hard-packed earth that turned to muck in spring and froze solid in the winter. Surrounded on all sides by low hills, stunted trees, and cold winds that never stopped moaning. The place didn't just feel distant, it felt exiled, like it had been pushed out of town by something older and quieter than shame. Built in the 1880s, it had once been a proud, square-shouldered structure. 2 stories of weather-beaten clapboard with a steeply pitched roof and a sagging wraparound porch. But by the time anyone gave it a real look, the farmhouse had collapsed in on itself like a lung long out of air. The roof bowed. The windows were smudged with grime. The front steps were soft with rot. Boards flaked away underfoot. Mice had made a kingdom in the walls. Spiders stitched curtains of web in the corners. It was more than a house. It was a ruin, slowly digesting itself. Even when it was occupied, it felt abandoned. There was no paint on the outside walls, no car in the drive, no mailbox, just acres of dying land and that hollow, gray-boned house crouched in the center like something watching. Kids from town dared each other to bike out to it in the summer, but few ever made it past the tree line. The place gave you the creeps even before anyone knew why. Inside, the house was worse. The first thing you noticed when you walked in was the smell. Not just rot, though that was there too, heavy and wet and permanent, but age, the thick, sour breath of time. Dust coated everything. Soot stained the walls and the inside of the windows. The only light came through slats in the boarded-up glass, falling in narrow bands that made the dust spin like fog. The rooms in the front of the house were strange, not because of what was in them, but because of what wasn't. A battered table, a few chairs, a stove that hadn't worked right in years, a pile of canned goods, newspapers from years ago stacked knee-high, cracked plates, rusted cutlery, jars filled with unidentifiable shit, Clothes hung from nails in the walls, socks, undershirts, a woman's purse, decades out of style, placed neatly on a shelf. Everything looked used and discarded at the same time. But it wasn't all like that. There were parts of the house that didn't belong to the world outside. Rooms that had been preserved, closed off, locked up, untouched for years. Behind one door, a bedroom frozen in time. Lace curtains, yellowed and thin. A Bible on the dresser, doilies. A single pair of women's shoes placed neatly beside a bed with a heavy wooden headboard. The bed was made. The room was clean. It didn't match the rest of the house, not at all. It didn't even match Ed. It belonged to someone else. It belonged to Augusta. After her death, Ed had sealed off her room like a tomb. He didn't go in. He didn't touch anything. He let the rest of the house rot around her. But that one space remained sacred, a monument to the only voice he'd ever truly listened to, the only one that mattered. She lived there still, not just in memory, but in presence. You could feel her, watching, disapproving, cold. That room wasn't just cleaner than the rest, it was heavier. The air in it didn't move. The dust didn't settle. Everything sat in quiet judgment. The duality of the house was too stark to ignore. Half chaos, half shrine. Half a nest of filth and madness, half a relic of control and cleanliness. It was as if Ed had been split down the middle, one side ruled by the rotting world he lived in, the other by the immaculate ghost of his mother. He never reconciled the two. He just lived between them. Slept in the kitchen, shit in a bucket, cooked soup on a rusted hot plate, and never once disturbed the order of Augusta's room. The deeper you went into the farmhouse, the worse it got. The rooms twisted in on themselves. Some floors had caved in. Rats scuttled from pile to pile, bits of bone, stains on the floor, empty skulls, dishes filled with human organs, tucked away like leftovers, lampshades that looked like leather, a wastebasket made of a woman's face. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, masked by layers of clutter and decay. The horror wasn't just in what Ed had done, but in how casually it all sat. A box of fingernails next to a half-eaten cracker, a skull beside a cracked radio. There was no organization, no attempt to conceal. The walls didn't scream, they just absorbed. You could stand in the center of the living room and feel it sink into your skin, the long, slow madness that had soaked into every board, every hinge, every floorboard. Some of the furniture had been handmade, if you could call it that. Chairs stitched with human skin, a belt strung together with nipples, soup bowls carved from the tops of skulls. There was no artistry to it, no finesse, just function. Like he was trying to make his house match the one in his head. Like the walls weren't just walls. They were part of a world he'd built, one scream and suture at a time. And yet, it hadn't always been like that. Once, this house had held a family. A father who drank too much, a mother who prayed too hard, two sons who didn't yet know what the world would do to them. The walls had heard lullabies once. They'd seen birthday cakes, heard the clatter of boots in winter, smelled pork roasts on Sunday afternoons. The front yard had hosted sled rides and picnics, and the occasional deer hanging from a hook after hunting season. There had been love here, of a kind. A tight, suffocating, punishing love, but love nonetheless. But by the time it was raided in 1957, that love had been buried, literally, dismembered, skinned, and worn like a costume. The house wasn't just a crime scene. It was a manifestation, a physical map of Ed Gein's mind. The decay was real, and it was a metaphor, a place where time had stopped, where rot was a kind of language, where every room told a story if you were brave enough to hear it. And in the center of it all, Ed, drifting from room to room like a ghost of his own design, listening to voices only he could hear, speaking to faces that didn't speak back, eating off the same plate every night, sleeping inches from the horror, unbothered. He didn't need bars to imprison him. The house was his prison, and his kingdom, and his mother. People burned houses to cleanse them, to take back power. Maybe that's why the Gein farmhouse went up in flames not long after he was locked away. No one was ever charged. No one ever came forward. But it wasn't hard to guess. It was an exorcism, not a crime. A way for the town to say, "We will not let this place live 1 minute longer than it has to." But the land remembers. Even now, long after the fire, long after the ashes blew away and the weeds grew back, people still don't go near where the farmhouse stood. You can't see it from the road anymore. But some say if you walk deep enough into the woods on a cold night, the wind shifts. It changes direction. And for a moment, just a moment, it smells like something buried. Not dead, just waiting. Chapter 3. Augusta's Doctrine. Augusta Wilhelmine Gein was not a woman who softened. She came into the world hard, stayed that way, and left it without apology. Born in 1878 to German immigrants, she was built of stern stuff, thick bones, thick hands, a spine that never slouched. Her eyes were pale and sharp, like frost, and her voice had a quality to it that made people sit up straighter when she spoke. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her words carried the weight of stone dropped in still water. To say she was religious would be an insult to religion. Augusta didn't believe in God so much as she feared him, trembled before him, saw him not as love but as judgment. And judgment in Augusta's house was everywhere. The Lutheranism she carried wasn't the gentle kind, not the Sunday morning community and potluck suppers kind. It was fire and brimstone, hellfire etched into the wallpaper, sin etched into every breath. She kept her Bible like a sword, read from it every day, aloud, not to comfort, but to remind. The world is filthy. The people in it are worse. Women are temptresses. Men are beasts. Sex is not love. It is rot, and only a narrow path, choked with thorns and abstinence and shame, leads to salvation. It was not a metaphor to her. It was the only truth. The world, she said, was damned, and she intended to keep her sons clean. Her husband, George, didn't stand a chance. He was weak, a drinker, a man who'd tried and failed at too many things and spent what was left of himself in the bottom of bottles. Augusta had married him out of utility, not affection. She didn't love him. She barely tolerated him. She treated him like a disobedient pet, scolded him in front of the children, called him a failure to his face. George drank to hide from her, and eventually drank himself into oblivion. His death was not a tragedy, it was a relief. Augusta raised her sons alone, even before she was technically alone. Henry, the elder, was a question mark to her, a good boy, mostly, but resistant, independent, a little too modern, a little too curious about the world. He would read books, not from the Bible, speak kindly of women, even make jokes. She didn't like that. There was something unruly about Henry, something that couldn't be ironed flat. She prayed for him harder than she prayed for Ed, but her prayers for Henry had teeth. Ed, on the other hand, he was hers, quiet, obedient, clingy. He shadowed her every step as a child, clung to her skirts, watched her mouth when she spoke, repeated her words back like gospel. He didn't question, he absorbed. He was a sponge for her venom, and she loved him for it, not the way mothers are supposed to love their sons, but in the twisted, possessive way you love a mirror. He was a reflection of her beliefs, a vessel for her fears. She wrapped him in holy fire and told him it would keep him safe. She homeschooled him at first, said the other children were godless, said the school teachers were sinners. When the state forced her to enroll him in public school, she did so with gritted teeth, and every afternoon she would drag him home and scrub him down physically and spiritually. Asked what the teacher said. Asked what the girls were wearing. Asked if any of them smiled at him. If they did, she told him why. Because they were devils. Because they smelled lust on him. Because they were trying to destroy his soul. He believed her. Of course he did. When you grow up thinking your mother is the only person on earth who tells the truth, everything else becomes a lie. Augusta taught Ed that women were evil, every last one of them, except her. Prostitutes, harlots, temptresses, all of them damned. They used their bodies like weapons, she said. They existed to lure, to seduce, to corrupt. A woman who wore lipstick? Slut. A woman who danced? Jezebel. A woman who kissed before marriage? No better than an animal. She told him these things not once, but constantly, whispered them at the dinner table, recited them over his bed while he slept, reinforced them every time a woman passed by the front window. And yet, Augusta was a woman, and she had to reckon with that in her own mind. So she carved out an exception for herself. She was not like the others. She was pure. She was chosen. God had spared her from the rot. And because Ed had come from her, he, too, could be clean. But only if he never looked away from her. Only if he followed every rule. She was cruel in the way that only the righteous can be. Not outwardly violent. Not abusive by the standards of the time. But she knew how to humiliate. Knew how to make shame feel like a noose around the neck. When Ed expressed interest in a girl at school, she slapped the smile off his face and told him that no good woman would ever want a man. "That's not love, Edward," she said. "That's the devil laughing through her mouth." So he stopped smiling. He stopped wanting. He crawled deeper into her shadow and stayed there. The irony, if there was one, is that Augusta's obsession with purity didn't protect Ed. It hollowed him. It made him incapable of understanding affection, of distinguishing between love and control, between flesh and sin. He didn't fear sex because it was dangerous. He feared it because it threatened to make him human, and being human meant being dirty. When Augusta died in 1945, something inside Ed ruptured. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't say much at all. But in the weeks after her death, neighbors said they saw him wandering the fields, dazed, whispering to himself. He stopped eating, let the animals starve, sealed off her room like a crypt, and let the rest of the house decay around him. Time didn't move for Ed after she died. Nothing did. He didn't mourn her. He preserved her, not just her room, but her teachings, her hatred, her doctrine. Years later, when the bodies were found, when the horror came to light, people struggled to understand how someone could become so twisted. But they never met Augusta. They never sat at her table. They never heard her voice. Ed Gein wasn't born a monster. He was raised by one. And he called her Mother. Chapter 4. 2 Sons, One Fate. In a town like Plainfield, nobody talked about things directly. They whispered. They speculated. They drew lines between dots they never dared to name. So when Henry George Gein died in 1944, people accepted the official story because it was easier than asking the question that had started forming in the dark corners of their minds. Easier than admitting that something was off. Henry had always been the outlier. While Ed clung to Augusta like a vine curling around a stake, Henry had grown up wary of her sharp edges. He still called her Mother, still bowed his head when she quoted scripture. But there was distance in him, a resistance. He didn't absorb her doctrine the way Ed did. He deflected it, quietly, cautiously, but it was there. He was the first to suggest Augusta was wrong, even if only in private. The first to describe her with words like overbearing, controlling, poison, and the only one who ever voiced real concern about Ed. Henry worked hard, harder than Ed ever did. He took labor jobs around the county, hauled lumber, did odd jobs for neighbors. Where Ed stayed close to the farmhouse, Henry stretched out, felt for edges. He spoke to women, occasionally dated, read the paper. He knew the world was bigger than Augusta's voice, and as their father's health declined and then disappeared entirely, Henry began to step into the role of the man of the house, though Augusta would never have admitted it. There were tensions. Henry saw Ed as weak, too soft, too passive. He pitied him, but also feared what Augusta's influence was doing to him. He talked about it with neighbors, subtle things, quiet observations, statements like, "I don't think Ed ever grew up," or "He still sleeps in the kitchen, like he's afraid to be alone." One man, Elmo Yuki, later said Henry once confessed he was worried about Ed's mental state. But in a town like Plainfield, that wasn't language people knew what to do with. You didn't call a man crazy. You just watched him out of the corner of your eye. On May 16, 1944, the Gein brothers set out to burn off a stretch of marshland on their property, a routine practice meant to clear away dead brush and ready the field for planting. It was late afternoon when the fire got away from them, driven by a gust of dry wind that fanned the flames too high, too fast. They separated to contain it. When the blaze was finally under control, Ed emerged alone. Henry, he said, was missing. That night, a search party was formed. Men from town combed the woods with lanterns and flashlights, calling Henry's name. Ed led them, oddly, almost too well. After a short time, he walked straight to where Henry lay face down in the brush, as if he'd known all along. Some of the men remembered thinking it strange. Ed didn't seem panicked, didn't seem relieved either, just dull, as if none of it really mattered. The official cause of death was asphyxiation. Henry had allegedly succumbed to smoke inhalation and collapsed. There were some bruises on his head, but nothing, the coroner said, that pointed to foul play. No autopsy was performed. This was rural Wisconsin in the 1940s. You didn't question things like that unless you wanted trouble. Henry was buried 2 days later. A simple pine coffin, no fanfare. But the doubts never quite died. The bruises, for one. More than one man swore they saw marks that didn't look like they came from a fall. And the way Ed found the body so quickly, how he walked right to it, in the dark, without hesitation. And the timing, too. Just a few months before, Henry had begun talking openly about leaving, getting away from the farmhouse, taking a job in another town, even bringing Ed with him, getting him out from under Augusta's thumb. But Augusta didn't want that, and neither, it seemed, did Ed. Then there was what came after. With Henry gone, Ed changed. There was no grief, not the kind people could see. No signs of mourning, no stories of brotherly loss. Instead, Ed folded tighter into himself, into the house, into Augusta's doctrine. He became quieter, more withdrawn. His eyes took on that blank, sunken stare that neighbors would come to know too well. He stopped talking to anyone who didn't live under that roof, which, by then, was just Augusta. It's not hard to imagine how Augusta received the news. She didn't weep. She wouldn't have. Henry had defied her. He had questioned her righteousness. In her mind, maybe his death was a kind of justice, a reminder of what happened when you strayed from the path, when you courted the world and forgot the wages of sin. If Ed had done something, if that fire was more than just a fire, he never said. But it's not hard to notice what came next. With Henry dead, the last crack in Augusta's grip closed. Ed was hers completely. There was no other voice in the house, no counterpoint, no escape route. He spent every moment with her, waited on her, doted on her, absorbed her more fully than ever before. He became both servant and disciple, carving himself into the shape she required. The transformation was complete, and yet, for all her power, Augusta couldn't outrun death. A year later, she was gone too. 2 deaths in 2 years. First Henry, whether by accident or something darker, and then Augusta, felled by a stroke that left Ed reeling, shattered, untethered. What was left after that was not a man, not in the usual sense. It was something else. A shadow with skin. A boy who never outgrew his mother's rules, never found the voice to say no. A hollow shape that waited 10 long years before the world outside finally saw what had been hiding in that farmhouse all along. Henry's grave lies quiet, a few miles from the spot where the fire burned. No headstone, no memorial, just dirt and silence. And maybe that's all there needs to be, because whatever happened out there in the marsh, whatever secrets sank into the ash, they burned with the brush. But the smell lingered. It always lingered. Chapter 5. Becoming Mother's Son. After Augusta died in December 1945, Ed Gein didn't bury her in the way most men bury their mothers. He held the funeral, of course, small, closed casket, a handful of neighbors, and a reluctant minister who said a few stiff words over a pine box. She was laid to rest in the Plainfield cemetery, next to George, and not far from where Henry lay in his anonymous grave. Ed stood like a scarecrow during the service, stoic, still, mouth stitched shut by some private grief. But it was all for show, theater for the town. In truth, Ed never let her go. The farmhouse didn't mourn Augusta's death. It calcified. The moment her body was lowered into the ground, Ed began sealing her life off like a shrine. Her bedroom, the sacred north room, was the first to be locked. He nailed plywood over the doorframe and hung a curtain in front of it, as if even the idea of the room needed protecting. It would remain untouched for years. Her belongings, her neatly made bed, her lace-curtained windows, her Bible resting on the nightstand. It all sat untouched, embalmed in dust. The floorboards refused to creak inside that room, as if the house itself understood what was being preserved. Ed began speaking of her in the present tense. Mother doesn't like when I do that. Mother wants me to stay home today. Mother wouldn't approve. He wasn't joking, not even slightly. There was no wink, no trace of sarcasm. He meant it. It didn't matter that she was in the ground. Augusta's voice had burrowed itself into his marrow and echoed in his skull like a bell rung under water. The rest of the house fell into filth. What had once been a rigidly ordered farmhouse became a swamp of refuse. Newspapers stacked in teetering towers. Animal feces crusted to the floor. Dried food stuck to plates in the sink. The same pot of gray stew boiled and reheated for days until it congealed into something gelatinous and sour. Mice nested in cupboards. Squirrels chewed their way through the attic. When a raccoon died in the crawl space, Ed didn't remove it. He said it was part of nature. Only the north rooms remained clean. He stopped sleeping in his bedroom after Augusta died. Instead, he moved into the kitchen, slept on a grimy mattress beside the stove, wrapped in worn flannel and moth-eaten wool. A kerosene lamp lit the room at night, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the cracked plaster walls. He kept the heat low, even in winter, letting the house grow cold and still like a tomb. He began regressing, slowly at first. His voice took on a sing-song lilt when he talked to people, like a boy trying to mimic an adult. He giggled at strange times, laughed at things no one else could hear. He shrank inside himself, no longer walking with the slow, plodding steps of a man, but with a kind of awkward shuffling gait, hands tucked to his sides, like he didn't quite know what to do with them. He would drift into town occasionally, always alone, always dressed in the same layered clothes, oversized coat, work boots, wool cap pulled low. People remembered how he'd look at women, not like a man interested in sex. It was something weirder, hungrier, like he was trying to understand what made them different, what gave them power, and what it would feel like to wear that power himself. Ed never dated. He never tried to. But he talked about women constantly, never in the way you'd expect. He said things like, "I read in the Reader's Digest about a woman who could keep her dead husband's body preserved for 7 years." Or, "Did you know the human body only takes 8 minutes to bleed out if you cut the femoral artery?" Always said with a straight face, always with those strange, childlike eyes. He told people he was interested in taxidermy. That was the word he used, but it wasn't squirrels or raccoons he was interested in. He started digging, literally. Night after night, he would walk the 2 miles from his house to the cemetery, shovel strapped to his back, flashlight wrapped in red cloth to dim the beam. He knew the fresh graves by heart. He read the obituaries like a shopping list. At first, it was curiosity. That's what he told himself. A desire to see Mother again. He never said Augusta's name out loud. Just Mother. Every body he unearthed was meant to stand in for her. Women around her age, women built like her, women with that same stern mouth and Protestant jawline. But the comparisons broke down quickly. He didn't just want to see them. He wanted to use them, piece by piece. This was when the real unraveling began. He stripped the corpses, flayed the skin with surgical precision. He experimented, tried to tan the hides like leather, soak them in oil, stretch them over wooden frames. He made masks, nipples, genitals. He kept trophies in boxes, vulvas preserved in salt, noses in glass jars, fingernails carefully trimmed and stored in labeled tins. One woman's face he removed completely, lips still faintly pink with makeup, and tacked it to the wall behind his bed. He would talk to it sometimes. Most nights, he sat alone in the kitchen, wearing scraps of what he called the suit. He made it from skin. A vest stitched from a torso, breasts sewn carefully to the chest, with crude stitching around the nipples. He would wear it in the dark, sit under the lamp, and mutter. Sometimes he'd put on a scalp, wig still attached, and prance through the house, mimicking Augusta's walk. He would raise his voice and speak like her, demand that he eat his supper, condemn the neighbors, warn him about dirty women. It wasn't just delusion. It was possession. He wasn't trying to remember his mother. He was trying to become her. The boundaries between fantasy and memory, sin and salvation, flesh and identity, they didn't erode for Ed. They exploded. What started as grief became obsession, and that obsession turned to madness so absolute it made death seem pliable. Like something he could cut apart and rearrange to his liking. He didn't need Augusta's permission anymore. He had her voice inside his head. He had her skin in his hands. The warning signs were everywhere. Neighbors who stepped too close noticed the smell, a sickly mix of decay and cooking meat. Children called him Weird Ed. Women avoided his gaze. He became a ghost in Plainfield, there but not there, present but untouchable. And because nothing had happened yet, no one had gone missing, not officially, the town let it be. Let him rot in that house, because it was easier to believe he was just lonely, just odd, just broken by grief. But it wasn't grief, not anymore. It was transformation. And the next stage would be worse. Chapter 6. The Town Loner. To most of Plainfield, Ed Gein was harmless. Strange, sure. Lonely. A little off in the head, maybe. But dangerous? That wasn't how people thought about men like Ed. Not in a town like this. If you called him anything, you called him a character. A man who fixed your fence when it sagged, plowed your driveway after a snowstorm, patched your roof when the shingles gave out. He never charged much. Sometimes he didn't charge anything at all. A couple of dollars, a few eggs, maybe a slice of pie if you had one to spare. He didn't want more than that. Didn't seem to need more than that. But the longer you talked to him, the harder it was to ignore the feeling crawling under your skin. He was polite, overly so, called women ma'am, even if they were younger than him, tipped his hat, shuffled his feet, and twisted his cap in his hands like a boy caught doing something wrong. But sometimes, when he didn't think you were looking, his face would change. It would go blank. Eyes glassy and black as a shark's, staring through you instead of at you. He'd smile at the wrong moments, little half-smiles that had nothing to do with what was being said, like there was some private joke you weren't privy to. Della Heath, who ran the tavern out on County Road A, remembered one night when Ed came in after dark, tracking mud all over the floor. He didn't order a beer or a sandwich. He just sat at the end of the bar, turning his coffee cup in circles and staring at the jukebox. When she asked if he was all right, he just mumbled, "Mother doesn't like music, not music like that." And then he laughed, short, high-pitched, almost a giggle, and kept turning the cup like he was winding it up. Children steered clear of him. They didn't have the words for it, but they knew. Kids always know. They said his house smelled like death if you got too close. They dared each other to ride bikes past the driveway and swore they saw things in the windows, shapes that didn't move right, curtains that twitched when there was no breeze. One boy, Tommy Roush, said he once heard screaming coming from the woods behind Ed's place. Not an animal scream either. Something human, high and sharp and wet. Nobody took it seriously. Kids had wild imaginations. Better to scold them for lying than admit you believe them. Women were uneasy around him in a way they couldn't always explain. Mary Hogan, who ran Hogan's Tavern, joked once that Ed was after her, but laughed it off. Said he was harmless. He'd sit at the counter and watch her for hours sometimes, nursing a soda, smiling that weird smile. He once told her, "Mary, you'd make a good wife. Mother would like you." She said it was funny, cute even, but when he said it, she said she felt her skin crawl. It was the little things, the way Ed kept shrunken heads in his house and told people they were souvenirs from a cousin in the Philippines. No one pressed him on it. Why would they? It was easier to smile and nod than to look closer at the stitched lips, the shriveled eyelids, the leathery skin pulled tight over tiny skulls. Easier to pretend they were just Halloween decorations, just oddities. Or the way he talked about anatomy. Most men avoided morbid topics at the feed store or the gas station. Not Ed. He'd wander into a conversation about deer hunting and start explaining how to dress a carcass, step by step, in vivid, bloody detail. Not just deer, either. He once asked a farmer, half-jokingly, "You ever wonder how heavy a human heart is? Lighter than a cow's, I bet." Then he giggled again, that nervous, broken sound like a record skipping. Ed took odd jobs at local farms, hauled hay, slaughtered hogs, shoveled manure. People liked that he worked cheap. They liked less how he looked at their wives and daughters. Long, lingering stares that didn't seem sexual, exactly. More like he was memorizing them, like he was taking measurements. Rumors trickled through Plainfield like dirty water. That Ed talked to himself, that he held conversations in the woods with no one else around. That if you passed his house at night, you could see light flickering through the cracks and hear things. Moaning, crying, strange chants. No one ever got close enough to check. You didn't trespass on Ed Gein's land. Not unless you wanted bad dreams for a month. A few people swore they saw him dragging something heavy across his yard late one night. A dark shape wrapped in canvas, bumping and thudding over the frozen ground. He waved when he noticed them watching, like it was nothing. Like hauling a body-sized bundle was just another Tuesday chore. Nobody said anything. Nobody wanted trouble. And so Ed stayed there, rotting slowly in his garbage heap of a house, getting stranger every year. He wore the same clothes day after day until they stiffened with sweat and grime. His boots were caked in something that looked too dark to be just mud. His fingernails were rimmed with black filth. He smelled of blood and mildew, a thick, sweet, nauseating stink that clung to him like a second skin. The town talked about him behind closed doors, but kept him at arm's length in public. They hired him when they needed cheap labor. They nodded politely when they passed him on the street. They warned their daughters not to walk alone after dark, but they never said why. Because in Plainfield, evil didn't look like a monster. It didn't roar or bare its teeth. It smiled. It tipped its cap. It shuffled down Main Street with its hands in its pockets, humming a tune only it could hear. And all the while, inside that crumbling house, Ed Gein was getting ready, getting bolder, testing the skin he'd stitched, perfecting the way he moved in it. The town thought they knew him. They didn't know a goddamn thing. Chapter 7. A Landscape of Graves. It always started with the newspaper. Ed Gein would sit hunched in the kitchen, a kerosene lamp throwing sickly yellow light over the battered formica table, and pore over the obituaries like he was reading love letters. His rough, cracked fingers traced the lines of type with a tenderness he never showed another living soul. When he found one that felt right, an older woman, stout of build, religious, respectable, he would sit back in his chair, nodding slightly, almost smiling. It wasn't just any dead woman he wanted. It had to be the right one. The ones who resembled Augusta in their faces, in their bodies, in the way the town had once respected them. It wasn't enough to remember Mother. He had to bring her back in pieces, stitch her together from the flesh of others. Funerals in Plainfield were simple affairs. A church service, a procession, a burial. No one thought twice when a grave was filled in the late afternoon, sometimes in poor weather, and left untended overnight. It gave Ed a window. A soft grave was easy work for a man with patience and no fear of the dead. After the town fell asleep, Ed would gather his tools, a shovel, an old crowbar, sometimes a hatchet. He wrapped a flashlight in red cloth to keep the beam from shining too bright, and he dressed in his darkest clothes, an old canvas coat, dungarees, rubber boots. He walked the miles from his farm into town, the graveyard silhouette waiting for him like a lover in the dark. He knew every path through the cemetery by heart, knew which headstones were fresh, knew which graves would be loosely packed, the soil damp and pliant. He would approach the grave like a man sneaking into a bedroom, careful, reverent, but trembling with a hunger he barely understood. Digging was back-breaking work. Wet soil sucked at the shovel. Stones clattered against the metal. Ed didn't mind. Sweat soaked through his clothes even in the dead of winter, and he'd work for hours if he had to, until the coffin's lid appeared under a thin layer of earth. He moved fast then, busting open the box with the crowbar, pulling apart the wood like it was paper. Sometimes he'd take the whole body, other times just the pieces he wanted. A head, a torso, a pair of hands, still curled as if reaching for heaven. He was methodical. If a body was too decomposed, he took only what he could use. Skin that could be tanned, organs that could be removed cleanly. If the corpse was fresh, it was better, easier to cut, easier to preserve. The stench was unbearable to most men, not to Ed. To him it was holy, a baptism in rot and earth and blood, the smell of creation. He worked quickly, stuffing the parts into a burlap sack, replacing the dirt as best he could, tamping it down with the back of the shovel. From a distance, you'd never know anything was disturbed. A footprint here, a crooked flower there. But in a town like Plainfield, no one noticed. No one wanted to notice. Sometimes he talked to the bodies as he worked, whispered to them, coaxed them from their beds, called them Mother in a voice so soft it barely stirred the dead leaves around him. He told them he was bringing them home, told them they wouldn't be alone anymore. He took them back to the farmhouse, dragging them inside like trophies. The kitchen was his workshop, his sanctuary. He'd lay the body parts out on the table, studying them with a craftsman's eye, Blood would puddle on the cracked linoleum. Flies buzzed thick in the warm, close air, but Ed hardly noticed. His hands were careful, skilled. He peeled skin from the flesh, pried bones from joints, tanned hides with homemade brews of oil and household chemicals. He experimented endlessly, learning how to preserve what he needed and discard the rest. He built his suit one stolen piece at a time. A breast here, a thigh there. He wasn't just stitching skin together. He was sewing himself back into the womb, patching the hole Augusta's death had left. He would wear the pieces when he was alone, pulling the skin tight over his own, feeling the weight of breasts swinging against his chest, the rough pull of a woman's face over his own. He didn't want to dress as a woman. He wanted to become one, to become her. The landscape of graves across Plainfield shrank, year by year, without anyone noticing. He robbed not only the newly dead, but sometimes those who had been resting for years, exhuming skeletons so dry they broke apart under his hands like driftwood. In those cases, he took what he could: pelvises, ribs, skulls. He crafted bowls from the tops of skulls, chairs upholstered with human skin, a belt studded with nipples like grotesque buttons. His house was a living tomb, a museum of the blasphemous and the damned. And still, no one knew. The town saw Ed Gein buying antifreeze and salt at the hardware store. They saw him grinning and ducking his head like a bashful boy when women passed. They didn't see the skin hanging in his bedroom like drying laundry. They didn't see the raw leather of human faces tacked to his walls, smiling, stitched smiles. The line between life and death had blurred for Ed. There was no difference to him anymore. A body was a body. A woman was a mother, was a corpse. Love, sex, memory, decay. It was all the same in that black well where his mind had sunk. When Ed Gein stood in the cemeteries at night, breathing in the cold, sweet stink of disturbed graves, he didn't feel horror. He felt peace. He wasn't robbing the dead. He was rescuing them, bringing them home, completing a family only he could see. And each night he did it, he slipped a little deeper into the darkness, until the only thing left for him was to reach for the living. And soon, very soon, that is exactly what he would do. Chapter 8. The Obsession with Skin. The skin was never just skin to Ed Gein. It wasn't just something he wore. It wasn't a costume or a mask for cheap thrills. It was a doorway, an ugly, beautiful doorway that led him back to the only place he had ever felt safe: his mother's arms. By the time the graveyards had stopped giving him what he needed, by the time the patched-together suits began to crumble and rot faster than he could replace them, Ed wasn't satisfied with scraps anymore. He needed more than pieces. He needed the whole thing. He needed to be inside her again. He needed to be her. He selected his materials with a ritualistic devotion. Not every corpse would do. The woman had to be middle-aged, heavy-set, pious-looking, Augusta's type, sturdy, grim, no nonsense. When he peeled back their skin, he wasn't destroying them. He believed he was freeing something holy, something sacred buried under rot and coffin dust. He wasn't murdering their memories. He was preserving them, loving them. The myth that Ed Gein simply wanted to be a woman is a comfortable lie people told themselves because the truth was too black to look at directly. He didn't want to parade around Plainfield in lipstick and high heels. He didn't want to live as a woman. He wanted annihilation, to erase Ed Gein, the fumbling, stuttering, filthy little man, to tear himself open and crawl back inside his mother's flesh, like an insect wriggling back into its discarded shell. He worked with a cruel, sacred patience. When he stitched his suits together, flayed breasts sewn to chest plates, thighs stitched into leggings, faces carefully preserved and lacquered to hold their human texture, he wasn't building costumes. He was building a body he could finally inhabit without shame. He tanned human hides the way a pioneer would tan deerskin, rubbing oils and homemade pastes into them, massaging life back into their stiffening fibers. The centerpiece of it all was the woman suit, stitched lovingly from the skins of several women. He sewed them by candlelight at his kitchen table, a rusty needle and thick thread clenched in his dirty fingers. He crafted full torsos with breasts attached, full legs with the flesh stretched tight and shining. He even fashioned a crude imitation of female genitals from actual tissue, stitched neatly into place like some horrific afterthought. When he wore it, it wasn't enough to simply drape it over his body. He transformed. He became. He would wait for the dead of night, when the wind howled across the fields and rattled the broken windows of the farmhouse. He would slip into the skin slowly, savoring the ritual, sliding his arms into the sleeves, feeling the cold kiss of the flesh as it wrapped around him, pulling the mask, stretched and stitched from a real woman's face, over his own. He would lace himself up tight, binding the suit to his body like a knight donning armor for battle. And then he would dance. Out in the backyard, naked except for the stolen skin, spinning under the pale glow of the moon, whispering to the night, speaking in tongues no living soul could understand. His bare feet slapped against the frozen ground, kicking up sprays of dirt and dead grass. His arms flapped clumsily, mimicking a woman's movements, his mother's movements, as he remembered them from some twisted corner of his mind. There was no sexuality in it, not in the traditional sense. Ed's crimes were never about getting off. They were about obliteration, about turning flesh into spirit, about becoming something other than the shriveled, broken thing he was born into. The house around him had transformed right along with him, turning into a cathedral of decay. Chairs were upholstered in human skin, lampshades sewn from faces, a belt crafted from nipples, bowls made from skulls, lips stitched together to make window pull cords. Death wasn't outside anymore. It was everywhere, woven into every corner of his world. The living room reeked of rot and oil and old death. Skulls sat on end tables, bones poked from the trash. Behind every door, under every sheet, another horror waited. A skinned corpse hung upside down like a gutted deer, a mask stretched tight and nailed to the wall, a mummified heart resting casually on the stove. But Ed didn't see horror. He saw comfort, companionship, order. Psychologists would later call it a complete psychotic break, a psychosis so deep that Ed had lost the ability to separate life from death, memory from reality. In his mind, he wasn't creating a grotesque art project. He was building a temple to his mother. He was surrounding himself with pieces of her, stitching them together like a mad quilt to crawl into when the loneliness gnawed too deep. When he wore the suits, Ed didn't just pretend to be Augusta. He became Augusta. In his mind, she lived again in the glistening leather of the stolen skins. She walked again in his staggering footsteps across the fields. She spoke again in his soft, murmuring voice as he danced under the stars. And the truth, the ugliest truth of all, is that for Ed, it worked. For a few stolen hours in the cold night, the darkness parted. His mother came back. She wrapped her arms around him in the form of the flesh he had pieced together. She forgave him. She loved him. But it never lasted. The suits rotted. The flesh withered. The magic wore off like a drug, leaving Ed alone again in his crumbling mausoleum of a house, surrounded by stinking, shriveled reminders of what he had lost. He could patch, sew, stitch, and dance all he wanted, but dead skin couldn't answer back. Dead skin couldn't scold him, love him, tell him he was a good boy. The fantasy was dying, and Ed knew it. Soon, the corpses in the ground wouldn't be enough. Soon, Ed Gein would need fresh skin, living skin, warm skin, still pulsing with blood and terror. And when he reached for it, Plainfield would finally see what had been hiding among them all along. Chapter 9. Mary Hogan. Mary Hogan was the kind of woman Plainfield didn't know what to do with. She didn't fit into the cookie-cutter world of small-town decency, didn't hide her opinions behind tight smiles or pious muttering. Mary was loud, boisterous, profane. She swore like a drunken logger, drank whiskey straight from the bottle, and laughed from deep in her chest, a gravelly, contagious sound that filled the smoky air of her little tavern. She was stocky, strong-armed, with a nose flattened from a long-forgotten fight, a scar across one eyebrow she never bothered to explain, and a pair of hands that could have wrung a man's neck or poured him a drink without breaking stride. She ran Mary's Tavern, a battered little roadhouse a few miles outside Plainfield proper, like a goddamn queen. She called the men who drank there sons of bitches, and meant it fondly. She called the ones she didn't like worse names. Mary had been born in Germany, back when Europe was tearing itself apart. She came to America for a better life and spent most of it wrestling drunks and bad debts in the back alleys of Milwaukee before drifting up north. She wasn't married, and she didn't give a damn. She smoked cheap cigars, cracked jokes about her own roughness, and made it clear to any man with ideas that he'd leave her tavern with fewer teeth than he walked in with. She didn't know it, but she had caught Ed Gein's attention. Ed would show up at Mary's from time to time, slipping into a booth in the shadows, drinking barely a sip from a single beer all night long. He watched her, not with lust, but with something worse, with awe, with loathing, with hunger. She was everything Augusta had hated in the world. A woman who laughed at men, who flaunted her body without shame, who lived without bending a knee to God or husband or fear. And deep down, Ed craved her way a drowning man craves air. He didn't know if he wanted to punish her or preserve her. Maybe both. On December 8, 1954, Mary Hogan closed up early. The snow was coming in hard, thick, wet flakes hammering the windshield of her old truck, burring the two-lane roads faster than the plows could clear them. She wiped down the bar, counted the till, locked the front door. She might have poured herself one last shot to warm up. Maybe she thought she heard a noise. Maybe she didn't have time to hear anything at all. Ed Gein was already there. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He raised the .32 caliber pistol he'd brought with him and fired. The bullet caught her just under the cheekbone, blasting out the back of her head in a wet explosion of blood, hair, and bone. She dropped without a sound, crumpling behind the bar like a sack of meat. He dragged her across the scarred wooden floor, her boots leaving long, bloody streaks in the sawdust scattered for traction. Blood smeared everywhere, on the bar stools, on the walls, a gory map of her final moments. Outside, the snow swallowed everything. No witnesses, no footprints, no second chances. He wrestled her body into the bed of his pickup, the back of her head a blackened ruin. Somewhere in the distance, maybe a dog barked. Maybe a light flickered. Maybe nothing happened at all. It didn't matter. He was already driving back toward the farmhouse, Mary's still warm body jostling in the back. By morning, she was gone. When Mary's friends noticed the tavern shuttered the next day, they figured she'd taken off. Maybe to Milwaukee for a supply run. Maybe to get away for a weekend. Nobody panicked, not at first. It wasn't until they broke down the back door and saw the blood, so much blood, that real fear seeped in. Sheriff Art Schley arrived just after noon. He stepped through the ruined tavern like a man tiptoeing through a dream. Blood sprayed across the counter, soaking into the floorboards. Bloody handprints smudged along the back hallway. A pool of blood congealed by the back door, as if someone had paused there, heavy and clumsy, trying to wrestle something too big to carry. They found her coat still hanging by the door, her purse untouched on the bar, cigarette butts in the ashtray, one still faintly warm. No sign of a robbery, no money missing, no struggle. Just blood and silence. Deputy Frank Warden scoured the tavern for clues. They found a single spent shell casing lodged near the bar. It was almost insultingly simple. Someone had walked in, shot Mary Hogan in the face, and walked out with her body. But who? Suspicion hung in the air, heavy and useless. Some muttered about strangers passing through. Some whispered about debts Mary might have had back in Milwaukee. Others just shook their heads and said nothing because deep down, Plainfield was a place that preferred to look away. Mary Hogan's face appeared in the local paper for a week, then 2. Flyers went up in gas stations and grocery stores. Volunteers combed the woods. A few state troopers were called in for a half-assed search. No body, no witnesses, no weapon. And no one, not a single goddamn soul, thought to suspect Ed Gein. Ed, who continued to drift through town with his lopsided smile and dirt-caked boots, making awkward jokes. Ed, who muttered at the hardware store counter one day, "Mary's not missing. She's up at my place." People laughed. Just Ed being Ed. Harmless Ed. Crazy Ed. At night, back at the farmhouse, Ed was busy honoring his prize. He took his time with Mary. She wasn't a rotting corpse from the cemetery. She was fresh, supple, a perfect offering. He decapitated her with a hunting knife, severing muscle and bone with slow, deliberate cuts. Her head he preserved, treating it with oils and salts, wrapping it tightly and leaving it near the stove where the warmth would slow the decay. He flayed her torso like a hunter gutting a deer, peeling the skin from her back and shoulders. The flesh was cleaned, stretched, oiled. He tanned it with the same homemade pastes he used on the other trophies. He didn't waste her, not an inch. Her face, what was left of it, he turned into another mask, a new addition to the grotesque wardrobe he was slowly assembling, piece by piece, woman by woman. The farmhouse reeked of death, rotted blood, old meat, the faint metallic sting of iron. But to Ed, it was the smell of comfort. It was home. He wasn't sloppy. He wasn't fast. He was careful, methodical. Every stitch, every cut, a love letter to a mother he could never quite resurrect. And still the town slept. The town smiled. The town looked away. Mary Hogan had been brash, vulgar, loud. Maybe, deep down, Plainfield believed she had brought it on herself. Maybe they found it easier to forget her than to face the possibility that something monstrous was growing right in their own backyard. The snow buried the blood. The rumors faded. The flyers yellowed on corkboards no one looked at anymore. And Ed Gein, the quiet little man in dirty overalls, went home to his trophies, to the dead skin stitched into life, and waited for the loneliness to gnaw at him again. He knew it wouldn't be long. The hunger was still there. And now he knew exactly what he needed to satisfy it. Chapter 10. The Hardware Store. November 16, 1957, began in Plainfield the way it always did, slow, cold, and quiet. The sun barely crept above the horizon, casting a thin, watering light across the snow-patched fields. The trees rattled their bare branches against the sharp wind. People moved through their morning routines in the dull half-light, their breath frosting in the air, their boots crunching over old ice. It was the first morning of deer hunting season. In Plainfield, that meant most of the men had disappeared into the woods before dawn, rifles over their shoulders, orange jackets flashing between the skeletal trees. It was practically a local holiday, a ritual older than memory itself. Stores would stay open, but nobody expected much business. Women stayed behind, manning empty shops or looking after the house. The town hollowed out like a rotted log, still standing but empty inside. At Warden's hardware store, Bernice Warden was settling into the slow rhythm of the day. She moved behind the counter with a no-nonsense efficiency, her thick gray sweater hanging loose over a long brown skirt. She was tough, practical, and as dependable as sunrise, the kind of woman who could run a store, a household, and a tight budget without missing a step. She had no illusions about the world. She trusted hard work, good bookkeeping, and common sense. Bernice had been widowed for years. Her son, Frank Warden, a deputy sheriff, was her pride and quiet consolation. She wasn't warm in the traditional sense, but she was loyal to her own. She kept her grief and her tenderness folded up inside herself like letters no one else got to read. The bell over the door jingled softly around 8:30 a.m. Ed Gein stepped into the store. He looked the same as he always did, shabby, slow-moving, muttering under his breath. He smelled faintly of earth and something older, something sour that people politely ignored. His cap was pulled low over his forehead. His heavy coat flapped against his thin frame. Bernice hardly glanced up. Ed had been in the night before, asking about antifreeze. He had mumbled something about coming back for it. She had told him the price, 50 cents a gallon, and thought no more of it. After all, Ed was harmless. Everyone said so. The store was nearly empty. Only the sound of the wall clock ticking and the faint scrape of Ed's boots against the linoleum broke the silence. Outside, the snow muffled everything, wrapping the world in a cold hush. Maybe Bernice turned her back. Maybe she bent over to retrieve something under the counter. Ed didn't hesitate. He grabbed a .22 caliber rifle from the display rack, a gun he had already eyed the night before. With a jerk, he worked the bolt and leveled the weapon at Bernice Warden's head. The shot cracked through the hardware store like a lightning strike, loud and final. Bernice crumpled where she stood, collapsing behind the counter without so much as a scream. Blood welled from the small, neat hole in her forehead, pooling quickly beneath her body. Her legs twitched once, just once, then stilled. The bell above the door jangled faintly as if in protest, but no one came. The hunters were gone. The town was asleep. Moving with eerie calm, Ed stepped around the counter and grabbed Bernice under the arms. He dragged her limp body across the floor, leaving a broad, wet smear of blood that shone dully under the fluorescent lights. Her shoes left tracks in the spilled antifreeze and melted snow at the threshold. He rifled through the cash register almost as an afterthought, taking a few dollars and scattering the coins across the floor to fake a robbery. It was clumsy, obvious, but it didn't have to be smart. It only had to be fast. Then he scribbled down a receipt for the antifreeze, using Bernice's hand to steady the paper, forging her familiar looping handwriting as best he could. The transaction was recorded neatly, a final insult to her last mundane act. With blood freezing on her blouse, Bernice was dragged out the back door and into the raw winter air. The snow swallowed the sounds of her boots scuffing the ground. Ed loaded her into the back of his battered truck, pulling a grimy tarp over her body. To anyone who might have looked outside, it would have looked like just another hunter hauling gear or venison, nothing more. But no one was watching. The cold had driven everyone indoors. He drove off with the same slow, cautious care he used whenever he was hauling something precious. Inside the hardware store, the clock ticked on. The door swung shut. Blood dried slowly on the counter and floor, blackening as it soaked into the wood. No one raised the alarm right away. In small towns like Plainfield, things were slow to register. People gave each other wide berths. If the store was closed, it was assumed Bernice had stepped out for lunch, or that she was busy with inventory. Nobody wanted to overreact. By mid-afternoon, when Bernice still hadn't been seen or heard from, murmurs began to creep through the town. Customers tapped on the locked door, peering through the darkened windows. A few mentioned it to neighbors, shrugging it off, but not quite able to dismiss the knot in their stomachs. It was Frank Warden who acted, Frank, who knew his mother's rigid habits better than anyone. She didn't leave the store locked in the middle of a Saturday without telling someone. She didn't miss appointments. She didn't vanish. Frank drove over just as the gray afternoon was sinking into a darker, heavier dusk. He parked in front of the hardware store, noticing immediately that something was wrong. The door was ajar, not wide open, just cracked, enough to let in a thin blade of freezing air. Inside, the place was silent. Frank called out for his mother. No answer. He stepped cautiously inside, the smell hitting him almost immediately. Metallic, thick, unmistakable. The register hung open, the cash drawer yanked out roughly, coins spilled across the counter like a child's tantrum. And then he saw the blood. A smear along the floor. A dragged trail leading through the back room. The receipt pad sat where it always did on the counter, but there, in his mother's familiar handwriting, was a name that made his heart stutter. Ed Gein. Frank backed out of the store like a man in a dream and called for the sheriff. Art Schley was there within minutes, his boots thudding across the bloody floor. He followed the trail out the back, noting the marks in the snow where something, or someone, had been dragged to a waiting vehicle. The facts arranged themselves like puzzle pieces clicking into place. Bernice Warden was missing. There was blood, lots of it. There was no sign of robbery beyond the clumsy stage scene. And the last person to see her alive had been Ed Gein. As the last light of day bled out behind the trees, Schley assembled a small posse, deputies, neighbors, state troopers summoned by radio crackle, and headed out toward the Gein farm. The snow was falling harder now, thick, wet flakes sticking to their coats, filling the footprints they left behind. Every man in that convoy felt the same unspoken dread curling in the pit of his stomach. They weren't just looking for Bernice Warden anymore. They were walking into something they couldn't name, couldn't understand, and sure as hell couldn't imagine. The clock was ticking. The woods loomed on either side, and somewhere in the frozen darkness ahead, Ed Gein waited. Chapter 11. Search Warrant. The drive out to the Gein farm took less than 15 minutes, but every mile seemed to stretch longer than the last. The dirt roads narrowed under low-hanging trees, weighed down by wet snow. The cruiser tires crunched over frozen gravel. No one spoke. In the silence, each man inside the cars replayed the details he knew, but none could fully imagine what they would find. They expected to find Bernice Warden, maybe dead, maybe tied up if they were lucky, maybe bleeding out in some back room, if God had any mercy left for Plainfield. Art Schley tightened his hands on the steering wheel as they pulled up the final lane. The Gein farmhouse stood hunched against the heavy winter sky like something abandoned decades ago, sagging into itself under the weight of time and rot. The clapboard siding was gray with mildew. Windows, where they weren't broken, were caked with filth. There was no light inside, no smoke from the chimney. The farm was silent. Too silent. Deputy Joe Wilimowski and a handful of others approached the porch with rifles raised. Schley pounded on the door with the side of his fist, his breath hanging in a thick cloud. No answer. He tried the knob. Locked. He jimmied it once, twice, and then signaled for someone to kick it in. The door gave way with a groan and a cracking pop. A wall of cold, rank air rushed out to meet them, thick with the stench of mildew, unwashed flesh, and something darker. Something faintly sweet, like rotting meat. Men gagged almost immediately, pulling scarves and jacket collars over their faces. Inside, darkness pooled in the corners. The hallway was narrow, the wallpaper peeling away in long, diseased strips. A single bare bulb dangled from the ceiling, swaying gently as if something had just passed by. They moved in slow, deliberate steps, flashlights cutting jagged paths across the interior. Dust swirled up in angry clouds with every footfall. The first room to the right had been what must have once been a living room. Now it was a chaos of overturned furniture, old magazines, broken lamps, and trash piled knee-high. Rat droppings glittered in the beams of the flashlights. A gutted mattress slumped against one wall, its stuffing vomiting out in yellowed clumps. Schlee's light caught on something hanging in the far corner, something that didn't move like cloth should. He stepped closer, his stomach tightening. It was a chair, but not just any chair. The seat and backrest were upholstered not in leather or fabric, but in strips of human skin, sewn crudely together with thick, waxy thread. Pores and hair follicles were still visible. Someone behind Schlee cursed under his breath, the words half formed and choked off. They pushed deeper into the house. The kitchen was worse. Garbage was heaped on every available surface. Grease coated the counters. Rusty pots and pans were scattered across the stove. Flies buzzed around an unidentifiable mass rotting in a corner. It was Deputy Wilimowski who spotted it first, something hanging from the rafters. At first, he thought it was a gutted deer. He stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight trembling. It wasn't a deer. It was Bernice Warden. She had been strung up by her heels, her body slit open from sternum to pelvis like a hunting trophy. The cavity had been cleaned out meticulously, every organ removed, the body drained of blood. Her head was missing. For a moment, nobody could move. The sight pinned them to the floor, rooted in horror. It was one thing to imagine a body. It was another to stand inches away from it, the reality sinking its claws into your brain. Wilimowski stumbled back against the wall, his boots slipping in something wet and sticky on the floor. Another deputy turned and retched into a corner. Schlee clenched his jaw so hard it made his ears ring. He forced himself to step closer. He needed to be sure. It was Bernice. He recognized her clothing, what was left of it. Her face, what had been her face, was nowhere in sight. They moved room by room after that, each new discovery deepening the nightmare. In a cluttered bedroom, they found a box filled with scraps of human skin, some of them fashioned crudely into masks. A drawer held a collection of noses. A belt made from severed, dried nipples was looped over a chair. There were skulls, real human skulls, stacked neatly in a row along one shelf, hollowed out and used as bowls. Lampshades stitched from faces, their features frozen in grotesque expressions of agony and terror, hung crookedly from table lamps. In a battered shoebox, they found a collection of vulvas, preserved and tucked carefully between sheets of newspaper, as if they were precious artifacts. Some had lipstick crudely applied. There was no order to the chaos, no logic that normal minds could grasp. Yet everything in the house seemed infused with a dark, obsessive purpose. Ed Gein hadn't just killed. He had collected, crafted, worshipped. They pressed deeper still, to the rooms Ed had preserved, the front parlor and Augusta's bedroom. Unlike the rest of the house, these spaces were pristine. No dust, no dirt, no rotting corpses or stitched-together furniture. The furniture was polished. Lace doilies sat neatly on end tables. Augusta's bed was made with military precision, the quilt pulled taut, the pillows plumped and arranged just so. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a shrine. Everything he had done, the killing, the grave robbing, the skinning, had happened around this frozen center. Augusta's room was sacred ground. The deputies found themselves whispering without meaning to, lowering their flashlights, tiptoeing as if she might still be sleeping somewhere nearby. Schlee realized with a lurch that in a way she was. They finally found Bernice's head in a burlap sack near the stove. Her eyes were open, glassy, and unseeing. Her mouth gaped in a frozen scream. And next to it, on a makeshift mannequin, was a face, carefully preserved and stretched over a crude form, staring blankly into the darkness. Mary Hogan's face. The scope of what they were standing in defied comprehension. It wasn't just murder. It wasn't even madness in the way people normally understood it. It was something deeper, some obscene rupture in the order of things. As they moved through the house, some of the deputies broke down, sitting heavily on the floor, heads in their hands, unable to go any further. Others worked mechanically, faces blank, as if retreating inside themselves was the only way to survive what they were seeing. No one had imagined this. Not here, not in Plainfield. When they finally emerged from the house, the night had fallen completely. The air outside felt cleaner, almost holy compared to the foulness they had waded through. Schley stood in the yard, staring up at the black windows of the Gein farmhouse, feeling as if the whole structure were alive, breathing, watching, remembering. They had come looking for Bernice Warden. They had found a house built out of nightmares. Chapter 12. The Trophy Room. It took hours to catalog what they had found inside the Gein house. It wasn't the kind of work anyone rushed into. It wasn't just evidence gathering. It was something darker, a descent into a human mind stripped of the protections and masks most people wear. Every object was a message. Every item was a secret Ed Gein had never spoken aloud. The kitchen table was cleared first. Officers laid out the things they had pulled from the house, one by one, trying to impose some kind of order on the chaos. They didn't have a name for what they were looking at. They only knew it had to be recorded, piece by piece, no matter how much it turned their stomachs. The masks came first, 15 altogether. Each one was painstakingly cut from a woman's face, preserved to varying degrees, and fashioned into a gristly second skin. Some were worn down and brittle. The features collapsed and caved in. Others looked freshly peeled, their expressions eerily intact, smirks, frowns, frozen screams. One mask had lipstick smeared across its dead lips. Another had pinpricks along the hairline where Ed had apparently tried to fasten it to his own scalp. It wasn't enough to wear a mask. It had to fit. It had to transform him. Each time an officer picked one up, they hesitated, the thing hanging limply from their gloved hands, the dead eyes staring at them. You couldn't just think of them as artifacts. They had been people once. Next came the vulvas, 9 in total, preserved, tanned like leather, carefully stored between pages of old newspapers or wrapped in cloth. Some had been decorated crudely with lipstick, as if Ed had been trying to make them look alive again, trying to erase the finality of death. One had a red ribbon tied through it. No one spoke as they cataloged them. There was no language to make sense of it. The belts came next, one of them looped and braided from dried human nipples. The texture was rough, pebbled like dried fruit. The idea of him buckling it around his waist, casual, maybe even proud, hung heavy in the air. The chairs were next, 2 armchairs upholstered in strips of human skin, the seams thick and visible. The flesh had been stretched taut over the frames, patched together without regard for pattern or uniformity. Arms, backs, seats, it was all human hide, stitched crudely, almost lovingly. Sitting in them would mean sitting on someone, probably multiple someones. In the far pile, officers uncovered the corset. It had been made from a woman's torso, expertly removed at the shoulders and hips. The breasts were still attached. The garment was slit down the back, suggesting Ed had actually worn it, slipping the hollowed-out skin over himself like a second body. They found leggings, too, sewn from flesh, meant to cover his legs like boots. In a battered paper bag, they found a handful of human lips, strung together on a shoelace like a macabre necklace. Each pair had been pierced and threaded with careful hands. They dangled and swung when lifted, slapping wetly against each other. The skulls came next. Some had been cleanly sawed in half and used as bowls. Others remained whole, though polished and hollowed out. They weren't just trophies, they were tools, everyday objects made from human remains, repurposed as if this were normal life, as if death were just another material to work with. Then there were the small, almost tender artifacts. A fingernail clipping, preserved in a tiny glass jar. A lock of hair braided and tied with a frayed bit of ribbon. A woman's severed ear pinned like a brooch to a piece of velvet. These weren't practical. They weren't used like lampshades or bowls. They were keepsakes, intimate tokens kept close. Each item they uncovered added another layer to the portrait of Ed Gein's mind, a mind that didn't just kill for the sake of killing, a mind that killed because it was trying in some broken, monstrous way to create something. This was not random madness. It was methodical. It was ritualistic. Every mask, every piece of skin stitched into furniture or garments, every bone polished for display, it all pointed back to the same black hole at the center of Ed's being, the loss of his mother. He hadn't moved on. He hadn't mourned like others mourn. He had tried to rebuild her, piece by piece, flesh by flesh. He was trying to crawl back inside her, trying to become her, trying to resurrect something that had long since rotted away into the frozen Plainfield earth. By the end of the night, the long farmhouse tables in the makeshift crime scene office were covered. Skin, bone, hair, teeth, all tagged, all inventoried. The officers couldn't unsee what they had touched, couldn't unfeel the texture of death pressed under their gloves, couldn't unsmell the rank sweetness that clung to every fiber of their clothes. Some of them vomited in the alley behind the sheriff's office. Others went home, scrubbed their hands raw, and still dreamed of the Gein farmhouse when they managed to sleep at all. In the cold, sterile inventory lists, it was easy to forget that every object once lived, breathed, smiled, screamed. In Ed's world, they never stopped. They lived on, in lamps, in chairs, in the second skin he wrapped himself in when the nights grew too long and the loneliness too loud. The farmhouse had been his trophy room, and it had been a temple, not to any god anyone in Plainfield worshipped, but to something much older, much darker, something that had lived and died in the small, cold heart of Ed Gein. Chapter 13. Ed Speaks. Ed sat alone in the small, windowless interview room of the Washara County Sheriff's Office. The walls around him were a faded, institutional yellow, the overhead light buzzing faintly, swinging just enough to make the shadows shift across the table. His wrists were cuffed in front of him, resting lightly on the scratched-up metal. There was a styrofoam cup of black coffee in front of him, left untouched. He stared at it now and then, but he didn't seem thirsty. He didn't seem to want anything at all. When the officers entered, Ed looked up and smiled, a thin, soft smile that didn't reach his washed-out blue eyes. He looked almost relieved, like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for too long, and now, finally, was being allowed to set it down. They started gently, careful not to spook him. They asked where he had been that morning, what he had been doing. He tapped his fingers rhythmically on the table, a slow, absent-minded beat, as though he were listening to a song only he could hear. When they brought up Bernice Warden, something changed. A small flicker behind his eyes, not fear, not guilt, something else. A kind of resignation, like a child caught sneaking a cookie, unsure if lying would even be worth the effort. "I guess I did it," he said, voice soft, almost embarrassed. There was no panic, no crying, no hysteria, just a plain, matter-of-fact statement, like he was discussing a broken fence post or a dog that had gotten loose. "I guess I did it." It wasn't the words themselves that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. It was the tone, calm, light, as if killing someone had slid into the same category as running an errand or fixing a squeaky door. They asked where Bernice was now. Ed shrugged a little, lifting one shoulder higher than the other, childlike. "She's out at the house," he said. When they pressed him on what condition she was in, he gave a small, almost bashful grin and answered plainly, "Dead." The casualness of it stuck in the deputies' throats. It didn't make sense. It wasn't supposed to sound like that, not when you talked about a woman you'd killed. The details came slowly, like dripping water from a cracked pipe. He told them he'd gone into the hardware store pretending to buy antifreeze. He said he'd grabbed a .22 caliber rifle from the display rack when no one was looking. He described it simply and with no emotion. He grabbed the rifle, the same one he had quietly eyed the night before, and with a sudden, jerking motion, he worked the bolt and leveled the weapon at Bernice Warden's head. The shot ripped through the quiet of the store like a thunderclap, sharp and final. Bernice dropped instantly, crumpling behind the counter without a sound. A small, clean hole opened in the center of her forehead, blood pouring thick and fast onto the linoleum floor. Her legs gave a single involuntary twitch before she lay still, silent, cooling in a widening pool of blood. No struggle, no screaming, just the mechanical act of ending a life. He didn't offer any real motive. They asked why he had done it. He tilted his head and squinted a little, like the question didn't quite make sense to him, like asking why the sky was blue. The officers didn't push too hard at first. They knew what else they had found at the farmhouse. They knew the horrors he hadn't yet admitted to. They wanted him to walk there on his own. When they asked about the blood trail, about the body missing from the store, he nodded. Said he loaded her into his truck, drove her home. Said it like he was describing picking up a sack of feed. He didn't seem to understand or care that every word that fell from his mouth was digging the hole deeper. When they moved on to the house itself, to the discoveries in the kitchen, the shed, the upstairs rooms, Ed remained oddly cheerful. He didn't flinch when they mentioned the human skin masks, or the vulvas preserved like grim artifacts, or the corset fashioned from a woman's torso. Instead, he leaned forward, like a student finally being asked about his favorite subject. He laughed once, a strange little giggle that wriggled out of his chest, when they asked him whether he had ever eaten any of the bodies. "No," he said, a grin breaking across his face. "No, I never done that. You don't think I'm crazy, do you?" He asked it like someone fishing for a compliment, like a man trying to be reassured that, no, he wasn't strange at all. The deputies didn't answer him. How could they? Every word he said made it clearer. Ed didn't fully grasp what he had done, or, more chillingly, he understood it in a way that was completely alien to everyone else in the room. He was polite, almost deferential, called the officers sir, smiled when they thanked him for answering a question. He sat with his hands folded neatly in front of him, like a boy at Sunday school waiting for his turn to read from the Bible. When they asked about the grave robbing, Ed was more animated. He described how he read the obituaries in the paper, marking them carefully, how he waited until the graves were freshly dug and the ground still soft, how he crept into cemeteries in the dead of night with homemade tools, shovels, ropes, a sled he'd cobbled together to exhume the bodies. He spoke of it not as a crime, but as a necessity, as if the dead owed him something, as if bringing them back to his farmhouse wasn't desecration, but rescue. "I wanted to make a woman suit," he said, the words plain and unburdened, "so I could crawl into her, be her." He didn't say, "be a woman." He said, "be her." He didn't have to name Augusta. Her presence was in every syllable. The room went still at that. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to hush. They moved cautiously into questions about Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who had gone missing 3 years earlier. Her case had gone cold, no leads, no body. Ed hesitated, the first real pause he'd shown. His fingers twitched against his thighs. But when they pressed gently, he admitted it. "She's at the house, too," he said, almost sheepish. He confessed he had killed her the same way, quickly, efficiently. One shot. One moment she was there, the next she wasn't. But when asked if he felt bad about it, he only blinked. A long, slow blink like an owl watching from a hollow tree. "I don't know," he said. "Guess it just got away from me." That was all. That was the confession. Not a storm of rage, not an unstoppable killing machine, just a slow, creeping rot. A life emptied out by grief, filled back up with corpses. By the time the questioning wound down, Ed had confessed to murder, grave robbing, body mutilation, and the grotesque transformations he had performed on the stolen dead. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't protest. He didn't seem to fully realize that he would never walk back through the doors of his crumbling farmhouse again. At the end, after the officers finished cataloging hours of taped confessions, after they stepped outside the room and exhaled the sickness that had coiled in their guts, Ed was left sitting there alone. The coffee was still untouched. The chair still creaked when he shifted. He looked down at the floor, blinking slowly, like he was already halfway gone. When an officer re-entered to escort him to a holding cell, Ed lifted his head and asked politely, "Can I go home now?" He asked it like a child who had spent too long at a grown-up party, tired, ready to go, believing, somehow, that the nightmare could be packed up and left behind. But there was no going home. Not anymore. The house he wanted to return to wasn't a house. It was a mausoleum he had built with his own hands, brick by brick, flesh by flesh. And the mother he wanted so badly to crawl back into was long gone, buried deep under a Plainfield sky that never forgave, never forgot. Chapter 14. The Investigation Expands. The walls of the Washoe County Sheriff's Office seemed to close in tighter with every passing day. What had started as a missing person case, a simple, if grim, local tragedy, had mutated into something grotesque and sprawling, a darkness so deep no one could see where it ended. The discovery at the Gein farmhouse had forced law enforcement to reconsider everything they thought they knew about crime, about evil, about the very nature of their work. Ed wasn't just a murderer. He was something else entirely, something they didn't even have language for. Their training, their experience, their gut instincts, none of it had prepared them for this. The first priority was securing the evidence. Every scrap of human skin, every bone fragment, every hollowed-out skull had to be cataloged, photographed, tagged. They wore gloves, though it hardly seemed to matter. The stink of the place clung to them anyway, soaked into their hair, their clothes, their skin. Some men vomited outright. Others forced it down, swallowing bile as they scribbled down notes with shaking hands. But once the immediate horror was contained, a larger, more chilling question emerged. Was Bernice Warden the only one? Ed had confessed to killing Bernice. He had admitted to killing Mary Hogan. But what about the other women who had gone missing over the years? The rumors about missing farm wives, the unexplained disappearances in the countryside, the shallow graves half forgotten at the edge of the woods. The police had no choice but to widen the net. The investigation expanded across county lines, across jurisdictional boundaries that had once seemed so clean and important. They reopened cold case files so old the paper inside them had yellowed. Files on missing women, primarily. Some young, some older, all from small towns like Plainfield, where people still left their doors unlocked at night. Towns that now looked a lot less innocent. The officers went back through decades of missing persons reports, matching dates to the times Ed had been at large. They made maps with pins stuck into every spot where a woman had vanished without a trace. The map began to fill up sickeningly fast. Then came the cemeteries. Ed had admitted to grave robbing, to exhuming the bodies of women who resembled his mother. But he was vague about which graves. Some names he remembered, others he didn't. Sometimes he seemed to be making it up as he went along. Sometimes he spoke with chilling specificity. Faced with no other choice, investigators began the slow, miserable work of exhumation. Cold November air turned their hands stiff as they dug into the damp, heavy soil. Family plots were disturbed, old stones shifted aside. Families watched from a distance, horror and disbelief frozen on their faces as men in uniforms pried open coffins that had been meant to rest forever undisturbed. One after another, the boxes came up. Some were intact. Others were empty. The first empty coffin they found was enough to stop the work for an entire day. It belonged to a middle-aged woman who had died a few years earlier, someone who, in her obituary, had been described as a devoted mother and a woman of strong faith. When they opened the casket, all that remained was a handful of damp fabric and a scattering of crushed bones at the bottom. No body, no flesh, just a hollow. The realization spread like wildfire. Ed hadn't just fantasized about digging up corpses. He had done it many times. Each new hole in the earth brought fresh dead. They found some bodies mutilated, missing heads, missing genitals, missing strips of skin. Other coffins were simply bare, scraped clean as if death itself had been interrupted mid-meal. The press caught wind of the exhumations almost immediately. Reporters descended on Plainfield like vultures, their flashbulbs turning night into day as they crowded around the edges of cemeteries, shouting questions no one wanted to answer. Small-town officials, who had never dealt with anything larger than the occasional bar fight or drunk driving accident, suddenly found themselves trying to manage a national scandal. They stammered at press conferences, issued half-formed statements, begged for patience and understanding. But patience was in short supply. Every family with a missing daughter, sister, or mother wanted answers. They called the sheriff's office day and night, their voices cracking with desperation. Was she found? Was she one of his trophies? Could they come down and look at what had been recovered? The officers didn't have the heart to tell most of them that there was often nothing to identify. No faces, no fingerprints, just scraps of skin, twisted and tanned like some grotesque version of leather. Just bones that could have belonged to anyone. Back at the Gein property, investigators continued to comb through the ruins, outbuildings, old sheds, pits behind the barn. Every inch of the place was treated like a crime scene, because by now it was clear that the entire farm was steeped in death. They found no evidence of additional murders beyond Bernice Warden and Mary Hogan. No buried bodies, no shallow graves on Gein's land. But that didn't bring much comfort. The real damage had been done elsewhere, and much of it would never be undone. Experts were called in, criminologists, psychologists, forensic specialists, men in suits with neatly clipped hair and clean fingernails who spoke in slow, careful tones about psychosexual pathology and maternal fixation and necrophiliac tendencies. They tried to fit Ed Gein into a framework, to box him in with words and diagrams, but none of it felt sufficient. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Ed Gein had found a way to blur the line between the living and the dead. He had built a world where his mother never left him, where the boundaries of flesh and spirit were as porous as a rotting coffin lid. The officers who had first walked into his farmhouse would never be the same. Some of them had nightmares for years. Some quit law enforcement entirely. They had seen something worse than murder. They had seen a soul collapse in slow motion over decades, until all that remained was the echo of one woman's voice, and the butchered bodies Ed thought he could sew into a replacement. The investigation sprawled on through the winter, slow and painful, bogged down by red tape and grief and a growing sense that whatever justice they might find would never really be enough, because no number of arrests, no number of confessions could unmake what Ed Gein had done. No neat courtroom verdict could sew the world back together. Some holes, once dug, never really close again. Chapter 15. The Insanity Defense. In the months following Ed Gein's arrest, Plainfield hardened into something brittle and cold. The town wanted answers. It demanded justice. But as the investigation widened and more experts were brought in, the truth everyone feared finally settled like dust over the frozen Wisconsin fields. There would be no simple justice. The prosecutors had a problem, a big one. It wasn't the evidence. God knew they had evidence. They could barely keep it all cataloged. faces peeled like fruit skins, corsets stitched from women's torsos, lips strung onto window shade poles. Every macabre detail, every grotesque artifact, built an ironclad wall around Ed's guilt. If Ed Gein ever saw the inside of a courtroom, there was no doubt he'd be convicted in record time. But getting him to trial was another matter entirely. Almost immediately after his confession, it became clear that Ed Gein was not a man you could simply march into a courtroom and prosecute like any other murderer. There were cracks in him, deep ones, that had nothing to do with physical evidence and everything to do with his mind. To move forward legally, they needed to assess his mental fitness, and so the doctors came. Dr. George Arndt and Dr. E.F. Schubert, both court-appointed psychiatrists, spent hours behind locked hospital doors with Ed. Their task was simple: determine whether he was sane enough to understand the charges against him and assist in his own defense. What they found instead was a mind so broken, so riddled with delusion and detachment, that the concept of trial itself became laughable. Ed spoke with them the same way he spoke with everyone: calm, polite, almost weirdly deferential. He didn't posture or deny. He didn't rage or cry. He simply answered questions as if he were talking about the weather. He described the nights he sat in the sealed-up farmhouse, waiting for the shape of his mother to materialize from the darkened hallways. He explained how he would read obituaries, picking out women who reminded him of Augusta, and then, shovel in hand, drive out to the graveyards under cover of night. There was no sense of wrongness in him, no real concept that what he had done was anything but natural. He described his grave-robbing trips with the kind of mechanical precision a farmer might use to describe fixing a tractor. Step by step, he detailed the way he would dig down just far enough to reach the coffin, pry it open, and haul the decaying body into his truck. Then, back at the farmhouse, he would carefully dissect the remains, taking only what he needed. The rest he returned to the grave or discarded somewhere on his property. When the subject turned to murder, specifically Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, Ed's tone didn't shift. There was no grimacing, no crying, no pleas for forgiveness. He spoke about shooting Bernice the way another man might talk about shooting a deer during hunting season: quick, clinical, ordinary. He recounted grabbing the .22 caliber rifle from the display rack at Warden's Hardware, leveling it at Bernice's head, and pulling the trigger. The shot cracked like a whip through the air. Bernice crumpled without a scream, falling behind the counter as blood pooled beneath her cooling body. Her legs kicked once, twice, then lay still. It was over in seconds, and Ed moved on as if it were a chore on a list, just another errand, another way to bring his mother back home. The doctor's reports were chilling in their unanimity. Ed Gein suffered from chronic schizophrenia of the paranoid type, with heavy layers of sexual psychosis and necrophilia impulses. His fantasy life had long since bled into his waking world. He existed in a realm where death was just another state of being, where corpses were repositories of comfort rather than reminders of finality. He was not sane, not even close. The court faced an ugly truth. Ed Gein was mentally incompetent to stand trial. He couldn't fully grasp the charges against him. He couldn't assist in any meaningful way in his defense. He barely seemed aware of the legal system at all. The people of Plainfield, already battered by the horrors of the investigation, reeled at the news. They didn't want insanity. They didn't want understanding. They wanted blood. In the diners and feed stores and gas stations, you could hear the low mutters of fury. Men who had lost their daughters, mothers, sisters to senseless tragedies in their own lives saw Ed Gein as the embodiment of every nightmare they had never spoken aloud. And now he would slip away, tucked safely behind hospital walls. There was talk, dark, mean talk, about vigilante justice, about how maybe the sheriff's deputies should have accidentally let Ed fall down a flight of stairs, about how maybe someone ought to sneak into Central State Hospital
and finish the job the courts refused to do. But none of it happened. The law, as much as it sickened them, held firm. The hearings were tense and fast. Sheriff Art Schley testified first. The man who had first walked into that house of horrors, who had seen firsthand the things Ed Gein had done, could barely keep his composure on the stand. His voice cracked once, and he took a long moment to collect himself before describing the evidence they had collected: the faces, the skins, the bodies torn apart and refashioned into furniture and clothing. The psychiatrists followed. Dr. Arndt spoke of Ed's delusional system, a complete breakdown between fantasy and reality so profound that Ed truly believed his actions were justified. Dr. Schubert elaborated on the extreme maternal fixation that had driven Ed's sexual and homicidal urges, explaining how Ed had never emotionally matured beyond a terrified little boy clutching at the hem of his dead mother's skirt. There was no real argument from the defense attorneys. There couldn't be. The evidence of insanity was as overwhelming as the evidence of guilt. The judge's ruling was almost anticlimactic. Ed Gein was found legally insane and committed indefinitely to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. There would be no trial, no conviction, no execution. Just a slow fading away behind walls thick enough to muffle even the worst nightmares. Plainfield tried to adjust. Some people simply never spoke of it again. Others drank harder, laughed louder, and worked longer hours to keep the images at bay. There were rumors, of course, rumors that Ed wasn't really crazy, that he had somehow faked the whole thing. But deep down, even the angriest old-timers knew the truth. Ed Gein didn't belong in a prison cell. He belonged somewhere colder, emptier, and infinitely darker. Somewhere even worse than death. And as the first winter snows blanketed the abandoned Gein farmhouse, hiding the broken windows and peeling walls under a clean, silent drift of white, the town of Plainfield settled into its uneasy truce with the past. The monster had been captured, but the scars he left behind were only just beginning to show. Chapter 16. Central State Hospital. When the thick steel doors of Central State Hospital closed behind Ed Gein in 1958, it was as if the world exhaled and forgot him in the same breath. No trial, no execution, no public reckoning, just the cold, bureaucratic act of vanishing him into an institution built for men like him, criminals too sick to punish, too broken to repair. Central State sat in Waupun, Wisconsin, a drab sprawl of brick buildings wrapped in fences topped with coiled razor wire. In the winter, the wind cut across the flat fields around the hospital like a scythe, the gales carrying the smell of burning wood and manure from distant farms. Snow buried the grounds in white silence half the year, and when it melted, the gray buildings looked no less bleak, no less imprisoned by their isolation. Inside, the halls smelled of antiseptic and boiled potatoes, a heavy odor that clung to every surface. Faint whiffs of body odor and urine sometimes drifted through the air, punctuated by the occasional burst of hollow laughter or an angry shout that quickly dissolved into muttering. Echoes lived in those corridors longer than the men did. Ed was processed like any other inmate patient. He was issued shapeless brown work clothes, assigned an identification number, and placed in one of the older wards, the ones reserved for the long haulers, the men who would likely never leave. The first few days, Ed barely spoke. He shuffled through intake like a shadow, answering direct questions with polite murmurs, his thin lips barely moving. He flinched at loud noises, but otherwise moved through the routine with mechanical obedience. The staff quickly noted his passivity. He wasn't violent like some of the others. He didn't rant or scream. He didn't throw food or fists. He simply existed. The psychiatrists put him on a strict routine. Every morning at 6, the fluorescent lights buzzed to life, and the men lined up to receive medication, a paper cup filled with pills for the mind, the nerves, the rage. Ed would gulp his down without argument, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand like a shy schoolboy. Breakfast came next: watery oatmeal, powdered eggs, a slab of cold toast. He ate slowly, methodically, chewing each bite at least 30 times, as if savoring even this pitiful pleasure. After meals, he was assigned to occupational therapy, a euphemism for the endless tasks designed to fill the time between meals and meds. Some men painted by numbers. Some assembled cheap jewelry for state contracts. Some simply sat and stared at the wall. Ed found a quiet sort of contentment in gardening. There was a small patch of land out back, fenced off from the main yard, where inmates could till the soil, weed rows, plant flowers and vegetables under the supervision of guards. It wasn't much, just a few cracked beds of dirt, but Ed gravitated toward it like a moth to weak light. He spent hours with his hands in the earth, humming tunelessly under his breath as he dug, planted, pruned. If anyone asked him what he was thinking about, he would just shrug and say, "Nothing, I guess." And maybe it was true. Maybe the old thoughts, the dark ones, had gone dormant inside him, or maybe they still lurked, like seeds buried deep, biding their time. The staff noted that he was meticulous in his work. His garden rows were arrow straight, his seedlings tended like fragile children. He built tiny trellises from scraps of wood, weaving them with care to support pea plants. He fertilized the tomatoes with crumbled eggshells collected from the kitchen. There was something almost touching about it. This man who had desecrated graves and stitched human skin into masks, now carefully nurturing petunias and cucumbers. In the evenings, he read. Ed taught himself to like adventure magazines and old almanacs. He paged through gardening manuals, anatomy books, dusty Western novels, and pulp crime stories that bore a twisted mirror to his own unspeakable acts. He read about pioneers carving new lives from the wilderness, about explorers charting the unknown, about outlaws facing the gallows with stoic grins. He never showed particular excitement or sadness over anything he read. He just absorbed it quietly, storing up facts and figures in that peculiar, self-contained mind, like a scavenger pocketing shiny stones. As the years dragged on, Ed faded into a kind of institutional myth. New orderlies would hear stories about him, stories that grew more fantastical with each retelling. Some said he talked to himself in his room late at night, holding one-sided conversations with his dead mother. Others swore they saw him staring out the barred windows for hours, unblinking, like an animal sensing something just beyond the edge of human understanding. There were rumors that he arranged food on his plate in the shape of skulls, or that he kept invisible friends tucked inside the folds of his threadbare blankets. None of it was ever proven, but none of it seemed impossible either. In truth, Ed had become institutionalized in the purest sense. He no longer belonged to the world outside. He spoke when spoken to. He performed every assigned task without complaint. He never tried to escape. He was, in every observable way, the model inmate. The public, for their part, stopped caring. After the initial media frenzy, the headlines moved on to fresher horrors. Serial killers came and went: Son of Sam, the Zodiac, John Wayne Gacy, men who craved attention, who demanded the spotlight even as they murdered. But Ed had no interest in any of that. He didn't want fame. He didn't even seem to want freedom. He simply wanted to be left alone, wrapped in the musty cocoon of his own broken mind. Over the decades, he grew smaller, not just physically, though he lost weight and his back stooped with time, but spiritually. His presence thinned. Staff who interacted with him described a man who was almost transparent, a man who seemed halfway out of this world already. His hair turned white and wispy, as delicate as spider silk. His face, once thin and fox-like, sagged into soft, jowly folds. His hands, once capable of grotesque craftsmanship, now trembled slightly when he lifted a coffee mug or turned the brittle pages of a book. He still worked the garden when his joints allowed it, though more often he could be found sitting on a bench near the hospital courtyard, hands resting quietly on his knees, staring at nothing. Sometimes a nurse would find him there hours later, stiff with cold but smiling faintly, as if dreaming of some distant memory, one better left unexplored. In rare conversations, he occasionally mentioned his mother, but never his crimes. If asked directly about Plainfield, about the farmhouse, about the lives he had stolen, he would either pretend not to hear or offer a vague, simple-minded comment like, "That was a long time ago." The doctors who reviewed his case over the years found no reason to release him. His diagnosis remained the same: chronic, untreatable schizophrenia, complicated by deep-rooted sexual pathology. He was, they wrote, institutionalized beyond meaningful rehabilitation. By the 1970s, very few outside the hospital even remembered he was alive. Plainfield had tried to erase him. The Gein farmhouse, once a rotting shell of horror, had burned to the ground under suspicious circumstances not long after his commitment. A few teenagers had been seen prowling the grounds with matches and whiskey. No one investigated too hard. The land was eventually sold off, the fields tilled under again, and a cautious, uneasy normalcy settled over the town. But Ed remained behind those thick walls, becoming less a person and more a lingering, unsettled presence, a ghost in flesh, haunting the sterile halls of Central State. He lived like that for nearly 30 years. Each day the same, each year passing like a gray, undisturbed fog, until finally even his body began to betray him. In 1984, Ed Gein developed respiratory failure, compounded by the ravages of old age and cancer. He was moved to the prison infirmary, where the machines hummed and clicked around his skeletal frame, the only sounds in the otherwise silent room. He remained polite to the nurses, thanking them in his soft, deferential voice, never once speaking of the horrors that had earned him this final, slow death. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein exhaled one last shallow breath and slipped out of the world he had once so deeply contaminated. He died without family, without friends, without ceremony, just a slight figure in a hospital bed, anonymous in the end as he had longed to be. And somewhere, in the small forgotten patches of earth behind Central State, the last flowers Ed had planted withered and died in the summer heat, untended and unmourned. Chapter 17. The Town That Forgot. When Ed Gein died, Plainfield hardly noticed. No parade of reporters this time, no flood of strangers eager to gawk at the butcher of Plainfield, no official statements, no memorials. Just a 2-line obituary tucked in the back pages of the local newspaper, squeezed between notices for used farm equipment and church bake sales. Edward Theodore Gein, aged 77. Cause of death, respiratory failure. No mention of what he had done. No mention of why his name had once been spoken in whispers, with a shudder, across every kitchen table in town. The people of Plainfield had done what they always did best, closed ranks and buried the past under a thick, stubborn silence. By 1984, a whole new generation had grown up among the cornfields and cow pastures, kids who only half knew the stories told in half-truths by nervous parents. They knew there had been a man once, long ago, who did terrible things, a boogeyman from their own soil. But they didn't know the full weight of it, the way the air in town had once felt heavier, the way neighbors had looked over their shoulders, bolting their doors in daylight. Some parents refused to talk about it at all. If a child asked, they were met with sharp warnings. Don't bring that up. If you know what's good for you, you'll leave it alone. Better to act like it had never happened. Better to pretend the fields had always been clean, the graves untouched, the town good and decent and safe. The few old-timers who remembered the headlines, the frantic search parties, the grim processions of body bags, carried that knowledge like a private infection. It lived behind their eyes, flickering there when conversation steered too close to the wrong memories. At the local diner, regulars still gathered for coffee every morning, their hands wrapped around warm mugs, their voices low and dry. The younger waitresses sometimes caught snippets of the past when the old men got tired enough to forget themselves. "Remember that winter? Jesus, the things they found in that house. You don't want to know, sweetheart. You really don't." And then they would fall silent again, as if speaking Ed's name might summon something from the frozen fields outside. The land itself seemed to want to forget. The farmhouse was gone, nothing left but a patch of bare, stubbled earth where weeds grew wild in the summer. No marker, no foundation, no memorial. Just emptiness, the past erased by fire and indifference. The surrounding woods had closed in, their edges creeping a little closer each year, swallowing what little remained of the place where so much horror had bloomed. On Main Street, the hardware store where Bernice Warden had vanished eventually shuttered its windows for good. The building stood vacant for years, sagging into itself, until someone finally bought the lot and tore it down. In its place went a parking lot, clean, flat, unremarkable. New faces moved into Plainfield in the decades after Ed's death, families looking for cheap land and quiet streets. To them, the town seemed sleepy and safe, just another anonymous dot on the map where nothing much ever happened. They had no idea what the soil under their feet had soaked in. The older residents made sure of it. They spoke about Ed Gein the way you talk about a dead limb, with discomfort, regret, and a fierce, unspoken hope that the rot hadn't spread farther than they could see. There were occasional attempts from the outside world to drag Plainfield's story back into the light. Reporters drove through town with cameras and notepads, poking their heads into shops, asking polite but pointed questions. Writers called the mayor's office, the police department, the library, anyone who might be willing to open up old wounds. Every time they were met with the same stony resistance. "That was a long time ago," they said. "We don't talk about that." Some nights you could still find kids daring each other to drive out past the old cemetery, the one where Ed had prowled by moonlight, shovel in hand. The bravest ones would park their cars near the gates and kill the headlights, daring the dark to show them something terrible. Mostly it was just raccoons or a drunk staggering home from the tavern. Still, the kids whispered that if you listened hard enough, you could hear footsteps between the headstones, slow, dragging footsteps, carrying the weight of something heavy and unseen. Once a year, around Halloween, someone would inevitably spray paint Gein on a stop sign or carve it into a bathroom stall at the high school. The janitors scrubbed it off without comment. Teachers muttered about disrespect and vandalism, but nobody really wanted to dig deeper. It was easier to treat it like a prank than a wound that had never healed. A few brave, or foolish, filmmakers tried to capture the town's lingering ghost on screen. They drove down dusty back roads with their cameras, trying to capture the real Plainfield. But nothing ever showed up on film. No bloodstains, no haunted houses, no screaming faces pressed to the glass. Just empty fields. Just an endless horizon of corn and silence. It was the kind of silence you couldn't photograph, couldn't explain to outsiders. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the deliberate, bone-deep refusal to speak, to remember, to feel. Some of the oldest residents, the ones who had lived through the worst of it, carried that silence to their graves. They were buried in the same dirt that had once given up the bodies Ed had stolen. Their coffins lowered into earth that had been disturbed more than once by hands that should never have touched it. In time, the town rebuilt its rhythms. The annual county fair rolled through with Ferris wheels and funnel cakes. Little League teams played on scrubby diamonds. Church bells rang out over empty streets on Sunday mornings. Life, in all its stubborn ordinariness, carried on. But in the back of everyone's mind, there was always that lingering knowledge, that unspoken truth. The monsters didn't come from somewhere else. They didn't creep in from the shadows, wearing masks or wielding knives. They grew here, among the barns and silos, among the steeples and cornfields. And sometimes, when the sun went down just right, and the field shimmered gold and black under the twilight. You could almost feel it again, that tiny, hair-raising hum of dread buried deep beneath the polite smiles and whitewashed fences. A reminder, a warning. Plainfield had forgotten Ed Gein, but the land had not. The land never forgets. Chapter 18. Influence on Fiction. Plainfield might have tried to forget Ed Gein, but the world refused. His story, twisted, grotesque, too bizarre to seem real, seeped out beyond the frozen cornfields and empty stores and took root somewhere deeper in the collective imagination. America didn't need another newspaper article or police report. It needed myths. And Ed Gein, quiet and almost forgotten in his locked hospital room, became the blueprint for some of the most enduring monsters ever committed to paper, screen, and memory. It started with Robert Bloch. Living just 50 miles away in Weyauwega, Wisconsin, Bloch was already a writer of pulp horror stories when he heard the first whispers about the man from Plainfield. The headlines were impossible to ignore. Ghoul of Plainfield, House of Horrors, Madman builds Shrine of Death. Details leaked out in twisted fragments, the masks, the skin, the shrunken heads, the missing women. Bloch didn't have access to the full case files. He didn't need them. What lodged itself in his brain was the idea of isolation, of a killer hiding in plain sight, living undisturbed in the shell of a normal-seeming life until something terrible slipped through the cracks. In 1959, Bloch published Psycho. His Norman Bates was not Ed Gein by name, but the fingerprints were everywhere. A lonely, mother-obsessed recluse, a crumbling house filled with secrets, a mind so broken that identity itself became a costume to be slipped on and off. In Bloch's imagination, Gein's grotesque trophies were refined into psychological horror. The skin suits and vulva belts became a split personality, a man who killed while believing he was his mother. The brutal physicality of Gein's real crimes dissolved into something colder, quieter. Murder with a knife, with silence, with guilt. Alfred Hitchcock, smelling blood in the water, adapted Psycho into the 1960 film that would birth a new era of terror on screen, an era where the monster could be the boy next door, the quiet man behind the counter, the harmless figure living just down the highway. But Psycho was only the beginning. In the 1970s, as America cracked open under the weight of Vietnam, Watergate, and cultural collapse, the old Gothic horrors felt quaint. Audiences no longer feared castles and monsters. They feared the neighbor they didn't really know. They feared the back roads, the empty farms, the places where civilization peeled away like cheap wallpaper to reveal something feral underneath. Tobe Hooper understood this instinct better than most. In 1974, Hooper released the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a film that felt less like entertainment and more like a transmission from hell itself. At the center of the carnage stood Leatherface, a towering chainsaw-wielding brute whose defining feature was the human skin mask he wore stitched across his face. The inspiration was explicit. Hooper later said he was fascinated by the real-life case of Ed Gein, by the idea that someone could treat human bodies as material for craft. Leatherface wasn't just a killer. He was a worker, a butcher, a product of his environment, molded by a family that treated death as commerce. Hooper took Gein's grisly reality and pumped it full of diesel fumes and desperation, creating a figure who lumbered through nightmares for generations. And still, the echoes of Plainfield rippled outward. In 1991, when The Silence of the Lambs introduced the world to Buffalo Bill, the lineage was clear. Ted Levine's character, obsessed with transformation, with making himself a woman suit from the skin of his victims, bore the marks of Ed Gein more clearly than almost any fictional killer before him. Thomas Harris, the author of the novel, blended several real killers into Bill's DNA. Ted Bundy's charm, Gary Heidnick's pit, Ed Kemper's manipulation. But the skin, The terrible haunting image of skin peeled and stitched and worn was all Gein. Even the setting, dark basements and cluttered houses of horror, bore the dust of Plainfield. Ed's crimes became something more than true crime footnotes. They became myth. Not the kind of myth told around campfires to scare children, but the kind that burrows deeper, the kind that reshapes how people see the world around them. After Ed, the lonely farmhouses looked a little more suspicious. The quiet, awkward man in the corner seemed a little more dangerous. The darkness in the American heartland became not just a possibility, but an inevitability. And as Hollywood churned out slasher after slasher, as Leatherface revved his chainsaw and Norman Bates smiled sheepishly at the motel counter, Ed Gein sat in his hospital room, aging quietly, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that he had become something larger than himself. He had become the template for the boogeyman, not a supernatural demon, not a phantom in the woods, but a man who had lived and breathed and dug and killed, and who, in doing so, revealed that the most terrifying monster of all was the one that looked so much like everyone else. The real Ed Gein remained small, quiet, and strange. But the version of Ed that lived on in books, in movies, in endless imitations and spin-offs, grew larger with every retelling, a shadow that stretched far beyond the snow-choked fields of Plainfield. A legacy built not from his own voice, but from the stories others told about him. And even as the real man withered into a silent ghost behind locked hospital doors, the monstrous idea of Ed Gein only grew louder, more grotesque, more permanent. A new American folk horror, stitched together from the bloody remains of a life no one, not even the town that birthed it, dared claim. Chapter 19. What We Choose to Remember. By the time Ed Gein had been dead for 2 decades, his name had long since transcended the boundaries of fact. He was no longer simply a man from a collapsing farmstead in central Wisconsin. He was something else now, an idea, a symbol, a grotesque shorthand for everything that could rot unseen behind the bland facade of American life. The real Ed, shy, soft-spoken, haunted by a mother he could never satisfy, had become irrelevant. What mattered was the myth, the stitched masks, the corpse furniture, the whispers in the dark, and somewhere along the way, the real human story, the slow erosion of a lonely, broken man got swallowed by the legend. It's easy to see why. The truth is messy. It's not cinematic. It's not clean. It's easier to remember Ed Gein as the butcher of Plainfield, the ghoul hiding in the farmhouse, than it is to wrestle with the real horror, that there was nothing outwardly monstrous about him at all. He shopped alongside his neighbors. He shoveled their driveways. He mended their roofs and smiled at their children. The darkness wasn't stitched across his face or dripping from his hands. It was buried, patient and silent, behind a meek voice and a lowered gaze. He was not an outsider. He was one of them. And that's the thing we don't like to remember. We want our monsters to be obvious, to wear their evil like a costume so we can spot them, so we can feel safe believing we would know. But Ed forces us to confront a deeper, colder truth. Monstrosity doesn't always announce itself. It can live quietly, domestically, mowing the lawn and minding its business, while underneath, a sickness metastasizes until the divide between sanity and depravity collapses entirely. His story is singular. There is no real parallel to the specific horrors he created, but it is also symbolic. Ed Gein is the end product of forces we recognize. A childhood shaped by domination and shame, a sexual awakening poisoned by religious terror, a life of isolation deepened by grief, rejection, and untreated mental illness. Strip away the grotesque trophies, and what remains is disturbingly familiar. A life twisted into something monstrous, not through a single event, but through years of quiet, grinding damage. He is a mirror, and the reflection is uncomfortable. He reflects a culture terrified of sex, but obsessed with violence. He reflects the suffocating ideal of the pure, sanctified mother, the pedestal that becomes a prison. He reflects a failure of community, the way small towns close ranks, ignore what doesn't fit, and in doing so, allow rot to flourish unchallenged. There's a reason why Ed Gein didn't spark just fear, but fascination. Why novelists and filmmakers return to him again and again, mining his story for fresh nightmares. Because under all the gore and skin masks, his life taps into a universal dread. That madness can wear the face of normalcy. That evil can take root not in the wild places of the world, but inside the places we trust the most. The family home, the neighbor's smile, the quiet handyman fixing the fence. What we choose to remember about Ed Gein says as much about us as it does about him. We remember the leather masks and the human skin lampshade, because those are shocking, tangible. We forget the long, empty days he spent alone after Augusta died, talking to himself in rooms preserved like mausoleums. We forget the years he spent visiting the graves of women he couldn't have, couldn't touch, couldn't resurrect. We forget the slow, inevitable decay, because that part is too real, too close. It's safer, somehow, to turn Ed into a cartoon villain, a Halloween mask, a horror movie archetype. It gives us distance. It lets us pretend he was born a monster, alien and unknowable, rather than shaped by the same forces that shape all of us. But the real horror of Ed Gein is that he was, in the beginning, so painfully human. And that somewhere, in ways we don't like to admit, we understand the hunger that hollowed him out. It's not about excusing him. It's not about sympathizing. It's about recognizing the awful, necessary truth that evil doesn't erupt from nowhere. It grows like mold in a sealed room, feeding on secrecy, repression, and pain. What we choose to remember about Ed Gein, and what we choose to forget, reveals the stories we tell ourselves about safety, about sanity, about who we are, and about how thin the walls really are between a life that looks ordinary and a life that hides a nightmare. In the end, Ed Gein didn't just live in Plainfield. He lives, still, in the uneasy space between memory and myth, not as a man anymore, but as a reminder. A dark reflection flickering at the corner of the mirror. A voice whispering that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they just look like your neighbor. Chapter 20. The Monsters We Fear Most. There are places where the past refuses to die. In Plainfield, Wisconsin, time seems to move slower, as if weighed down by something heavy and unseen. The corn still grows thick in the summer. The snow still silences the fields in winter. People still nod politely to strangers. And yet, underneath it all, something restless hums. A bruise beneath the skin that never quite fades. They tore down the Gein farmhouse in 1958. It burned under suspicious circumstances, reduced to blackened timber and smoldering ash. Locals said it was an accident. Others said it was mercy. Either way, no one rebuilt. The land where Ed's house once stood is empty now, a stretch of weeds and scattered stones, ringed by rustling barbed wire, a wound scabbed over but never healed. Ed himself died quietly, tucked away in the sterile corridors of a state institution. No final words, no grand revelations, just a sagging body that eventually gave out, like an old clock winding down. He was buried in the same cemetery he once desecrated, surrounded by the very graves he had raided in the darkness decades before. Somewhere among the broken headstones and flattened grass lies the man who once made horror breathe in Plainfield. And yet, despite all efforts to bury the past, Ed Gein refuses to stay dead. He lingers, not in body, but in story, in movies, in books, in whispered warnings told across campfires and late-night roads. Every time a character dons a mask of human skin, or a killer hides in the walls of a seemingly normal house, Ed flickers back into existence. Not fully, not tangibly, but enough to stain the air. Maybe that's why we keep coming back to him, not because of the specifics, the trophies, the killings, the grave robbing, but because of what he represents. A reminder that darkness doesn't live solely in far-off monsters and foreign lands. It lives here, next door, inside the quiet man who offers to shovel your walkway, inside the dusty farmhouse at the end of a gravel road, inside the parts of ourselves we refuse to examine too closely. There is comfort in forgetting. There's danger in it, too. Ed Gein was a singular horror, a perfect storm of madness, repression, grief, and isolation. But he was not conjured from nothing. He was shaped by hands that believed they were doing good, by a town that looked away when it should have seen, by a world that mistakes silence for safety. The house is gone. The bones are buried. The hardware store is shuttered. The headlines have yellowed and faded. But the fear he awakened, that ordinary life can hide extraordinary evil, remains. It breathes under the floorboards. It flickers in the corners of the mirror. We tell ourselves that Ed Gein is a relic of the past, a ghost story to scare children, a monster in a time when monsters were easier to spot. But if you drive the back roads of Plainfield, if you listen closely when the wind curls through the trees, you might hear something else. A reminder. The monsters we fear most are not the ones that roar and rage. They are the ones that smile and wave, then turn back to their dark, quiet work, unseen, unnoticed, until it's too late. And sometimes they are the ones we already know.